Thinking Architecturally with Nathaniel Schutta.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast, deliver quality, and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software architecture company empowering .NET teams to be just absolutely amazing. And they are hiring all levels of architects. So you can go to clearmeasure.com to look at that. My architect forums that I started at the beginning of the year are still going strong. Signups for the next session are up. Now, if you lead a software team and are looking to collaborate with your peers across the industry, you don't have a peer group at your own organization because you actually run the software team, and there's only one of you, hey, sign up at the link in the show notes. It's a great time every month. And for those who are looking for my Programming with Palermo video podcast, just search in any of the podcast directories and you'll be able to find it. So my guest today on the show is Nathaniel Schutta, or Nate for short, and he's a software architect based and focused on cloud computing and building usable applications. He's a proponent of polyglot programming and has written multiple books and appeared in various videos. He's also a seasoned speaker, regularly presenting at conferences worldwide, such as No Fluff Just Stuff Symposium, meetups, universities, user groups, Kansas City Developer Conference. In addition to his day job, Nate is an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota, where he teaches students to embrace and evaluate technical change. And he's driven to rid the world of bad presentations. And he co-authored the book Presentation Patterns with Neil Ford and Matthew McCullough. And he's also published a book called Thinking Architecturally and Responsible Microservices. Both of those books are available as free downloads from VMware. And he also has a new book announcement that I won't steal his thunder. We'll get to that later in the show. But Nate, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Oh, fantastic. Thanks, Jeffrey. Thanks for having me here. It's always a pleasure. I was delighted we got a chance to hang out a little bit at KCDC. I should have worn the KCDC shirt today. I don't know what I was thinking. It wasn't the next one on the pile, I guess.
You got the UberConf shirt on.
Here. I do. Yeah. UberConf was just in July. Hard to believe that. Well, God, it's already been a month ago. I don't know where this summer is going. I don't know where this year is going. I'm shocked that it's basically fall's right around the corner. And that makes me sad because that means winter's coming.
Oh, and in Minnesota, that's a big deal.
Yeah. Winter's no nonsense where I'm from. So, I prefer the times of years where we don't have snow on the ground, but that's just me. I'm not a skier, cross country or otherwise. So I would much prefer to be able to go play golf.
Yes. Yeah. Well, there's always snowmobiling, eh?
That's true. Yeah. We call them snowmobiles, not snow machines here. And that's a very common thing to see people run around on those in my neighborhood and on the trails near my house. So
yeah,
But my only problem with snowmobiling is that it seems like you spend just as much time fixing your snowmobile as you do actually driving it. So That's why I've never quite gotten into that space.
Yeah, it's pretty unique machine. There's none of those in Texas.
It truly is. Yeah, no, definitely not something that resonates south of a certain point for sure.
Right. Well, there's a good number who've seen you speak at No Fluff or UberConf or Kansas City Developers Conference or any number of those. But for the people who aren't familiar with you, never seen you speak, or haven't read one of your books or whatnot, give us a little background. I mean, what are the high points in your career that have kind of pushed you along the way and focused on the part of the industry and the technical work that you're doing today?
That's a good question. So I've been doing this a long time, longer than I care to admit. I've got some gray hair, not a lot, but a little. And I started where a lot of us start, right? We replaced some old systems, and I got it in the right place at the right time, got to work on an early Java web app, and that sort of propelled me down that path. I've done various things in that regard. I went to a software company for a couple of years. I was at a consulting company for a brief period of time, and spent a lot of my time in sort of enterprise IT, building enterprise web apps of various shapes and measures.
Mm-hmm.
And along the way, I decided like this architecture thing's kind of fun. I had an architect on my first web project, and I liked him personally. Although we started calling him Dr. Evil because anytime he would wander over to our area, he'd kind of like, hey, everybody, guess what? Small matter of implementation detail, but you just need to throw away everything you wrote for the last couple of weeks and start over.
Oh,
I'm like,
gosh.
oh, okay, great, cool. And so we always associated rework with him, fortunately or unfortunately. But I thought, hey, this looks like a cool gig. I want to be the person who gets to tell everybody what JavaScript framework we're all going to hate in 6 months. And so I just sort of gravitated towards that. And I kept kind of poking and prodding. And eventually, I think mostly to shut me up, they moved me over to the architecture group and fell in love with that and enjoyed the heck out of that. It's a very different challenge than what I faced as a software engineer. But for me, I think a real positive shift. And, I enjoy that level of interaction. And I like being able to influence an entire organization as opposed to just one project.
Mm-hmm.
It certainly has its frustrations. There's no getting around that. But I really like the fact that we get an opportunity to work at a little higher level of abstraction and help on a larger scale in some cases.
Yeah. For as much great work as the various framework and language vendors do, and all the people creating commercial components and whatnot, there's so many gaps that developers have to figure out just to put it all together and do interesting things.
Yeah, for sure. And this is what you and I were talking a little bit on the pre-show. And part of what I'm trying to do with the current book project is fill in some of those gaps, right? Because there's this pile of things that we teach you in an undergraduate computer science program, and there's a pile of things we teach you if you go to a boot camp, and there's overlap for sure, but not as much as maybe we'd like. And then there's all this stuff that you need to know to be successful on a project. I think back to when I first got into the industry. I had my shiny little computer science degree and I thought I knew what I was doing. And then you get on a project that has been in flight for several years.
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't 3,000 lines of code. It's 3 million lines of code. And it's not going to end at the end of the semester.
Yeah.
It just goes on and on and on. And it isn't just you and one other person. It's 10 or 15 or 100 people all working on this thing. And you start to go, wow, there's a lot of stuff I don't understand, And so you pick it up, and some of us pick it up faster. Some of us maybe get in the right spot where you get a mentor who can kind of guide you and say, hey, you should read this and you should learn about that. But I realized a few years ago, I was talking with somebody and I mentioned design patterns. I said, that's just a standard gang of 4 pattern. And this person just stared at me. And I said, well, gang of 4, right? I mean, you've heard of that. He's like, no. I'm like, well, you've read the Gang of 4 book? No. I had to Google what the book's actually called because like I couldn't.
Almost 30 years ago now.
Right. And it occurred to me that, okay, so this person is right out of school.
Yeah.
And so they haven't been exposed to that yet. I've had the good fortune, I guess, of kind of growing up with these things. And so for me, each one was kind of incremental.
Yeah.
And it's nowhere near as daunting as, I think about, in fact, this was a question that I got earlier today about how do you learn something like Spring if you're new to it? It's like, well, it's big, right? I mean, this thing that's been around now for a couple of decades. Well, I, again, had the luxury of growing up with it. And so it was an incremental learning. And it's like, yeah, it's overwhelming if you try to eat it all in one bite. In fact, you can't. So you just got to kind of do bit by bit, try out a few things, do a few tutorials, work your way through it, build an app that scratches an itch for you. But it occurred to me that there's a lot of folks every year who are graduating, again, whether that's from a boot camp or from an undergraduate program, they haven't been exposed to these things that you or I might take for granted, that somebody joining my team knows what a singleton is, knows what a factory is, and, knows what an adapter is. It's like, well, they don't know it if we don't teach it to them.
Yeah.
And so that kind of got me thinking like, all right, well, what else is in this giant gap? And it's things like, how do you read code? They never taught me how to read code when I was an undergrad. You just go write it. And I thought, man, I wouldn't teach you Spanish by saying, no, go write some Spanish. No, you learn the grammar and you learn the alphabet and you work your way through it. And yet the
kindergartners should start writing essays. Then when you're in 10th grade, we'll teach you to read.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you'd never flip it in that order. And then that's the way we do it. And I thought, well, that's interesting because the writing code part, like the grammar, the keywords, that stuff, especially once you've learned a couple languages, that's not the hard part. It's thinking in that language takes some time. But then there's all those design considerations and all the, well, what about this and what about that? And of course, so many of the answers in our space are, it depends. And,
Well,
that challenge of how do we name things, and et cetera, et cetera.
Well, speaking of the multiple languages you just mentioned, I'd say that most of the people listening to this podcast are working with C# and related languages, and .NET and Azure and the whole Microsoft ecosystem. And maybe there's just absolutely so many new developers in the last 7 years, heck, the last 10 years, where you start with one language and you're taught how to build applications, and everything's in the lens of that one language. And so, you wrote a book on thinking architecturally. Is it possible, and at what level can you start thinking and talking about software the same, regardless if, it was at one company and they tend to prefer one language, or another company, they tend to prefer a different language? And is that actually possible, or at what level does some of it become possible?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, obviously the implementation details differ. And, Layla Porter, dear friend of mine, I always love to say, hey, you capitalize things wrong, right? And then she rolls her eyes at me, and we have a little laugh, because of course I mean that in jest. It's all arbitrary, whether your brackets go here or there, whether you use camel case or this case. I mean, it doesn't really matter. The compiler doesn't care. It's really just what we want to see and what we're used to, right?
Well, all the documentation for a particular language tends to prefer some of those conventions.
Of course. Well, and let's not forget tabs versus spaces. I mean, how many times have you had a knockdown, drag out argument over something like that? I mean, God, I remember pairing with somebody on a project, and we spent the first 45 minutes him just going through and reformatting the code the way he wanted to see it. This was before we had all those nifty auto formatters and IDEs that would do all that for us. And I thought, this is not a productive use of our time. We have problems to solve. Can we go solve the problem instead of you being so anal retentive about exactly how this looks on your screen? But I get it. You want people in our space to be anal retentive. I think that's a feature, not a bug.
And now we've let JetBrains decide for us. Okay, what's the default of the tool? Let's go.
That's fine. Yeah, it's not worth arguing about. I think about how many times on projects that I thought that was such an important thing, and then you start to realize as you get older, that wasn't a productive conversation.
Right.
But it felt like a big deal at the time. So a lot of these patterns repeat, and I think sometimes we view all these industries as being so unique and distinct, and obviously there's different constraints, there's different business drivers, but the biggest shift I've seen in my career, when I first got out of university, my first job, pretty early on, the CIO had this presentation that he gave to all the new hires, and he was very adamant that we are not a technology company. We are a financial services company. We as an IT department are here to serve the business. We are we are not a revenue generator, blah, blah, blah. And I thought that was a little odd even at the time, because I'm like, well, it's the biggest budget in the company and it's the biggest headcount in the company, but you're saying we're not a technology company. Now, in fairness, what he was also trying to say, and he made this fairly explicit, if you're looking for that, we're not going to make you, this isn't a good fit for you, and you're going to be unhappy, but we have good work-life balance and we have all these other cool perks, so it's part of that trade-off. This would have been 4-ish years ago. I was with one of our clients, and their CIO got up in front of a room full of developers and said, folks, you got to understand, we're a technology company that happens to be in retail. And I thought, wow, that's the 20-year difference right there. And so there are similar patterns that repeat. There are similar things that we need. You think about distributed applications today. Whether you're doing that in Java, you're doing that in .NET, you're doing that in something else, you're going to need some circuit breakers. You're going to need observability, and so a lot of these things carry across regardless of that.
Just for the younger people, if you could define them as you go along.
Yeah, so circuit breaker basically says if I've got a vulnerable call, whether that's involves a network hop or not, doesn't really matter. But let's say I'm calling a service that you wrote, microservice or otherwise. If that fails, how should my system respond to that? It's malpractice for my system just to give my user a stack trace. Or unexpected error like that.
Please try again. That
means I didn't do my job. Right. So I can wrap that vulnerable call in a circuit breaker, which basically says, hey, if I call this thing and it's not working and I exceed some error threshold, I'm not going to keep calling it because that's silly. It's just going to keep returning a bad result. So then I, as a developer, can configure what should you do when we run into this bad result. Is it a cached answer? Is it I just always return 42? Is it call a third party, another service, a backup service, whatever makes sense for that particular environment. So it's like the circuit breaker in your house, where if a bad thing happens, you got too much whatever going through your circuits, the circuit breaker opens, preventing you from frying out your circuits. It's actually happened to us about maybe 6 weeks ago. My wife bought an air fryer, plugged it into the same circuit as the microwave, had them both running, and then the lights in the kitchen went off. Okay, cool. It did its job, right? Now,
nothing exploded.
Nothing exploded. There were no fires. The smoke did not escape. So that's always a good thing. Everything still works. But we then moved the air fryer to a different part of the kitchen. So lesson learned. Same thing with software, where the difference, of course, is that a software circuit breaker can actually kind of watch the thing you're trying to call. And if it's now healthy, cool, we'll close the circuit and go back to the way things were. So that's a really important thing to have in a distributed system. So as an architect, whether I'm on a Java project, a .NET project, et cetera. In fact, the first project I ever architected as an architect was a C# project. And I'd never written a line of C# in anger. And so it was kind of a weird experience, because I was so used to being the tech lead type person. And here I am in a project where, I can kind of read the code. Java and C# are pretty darn close, so I can get the gist of it. But you don't want me messing around in that code. I'm going to make things worse. And so it was a very strange experience to know that it would be bad for me to actually be in the editor trying to add code to this project, right?
Yeah.
But you start to realize those patterns exist regardless of implementation detail. Observability is the same box, where I need to know what's going on in my system. I've worked on systems in the past where I had all the code at my disposal. I could just put in a breakpoint and march my way through it. Distributed architecture, pretty good chance at least some of that code is not something I control. Someone else wrote it. It's a different part of my company, a different part of the universe, potentially. It might be from a third party thing. I can't just put a breakpoint in.
Yeah.
And, you throw events on top of that where I may not even know where all these calls go. If I don't have good observability and monitoring in place to see what is going on, what was called, what was the path from customer clicked here, and then I got this error. What did we track through to get there? So I can reproduce it to figure out how do I fix it. So those kinds of things to me are universal. And there's several more that fit into that bucket for sure.
Yeah. As you're talking about that part of monitoring and telemetry, I just remembered we're in the double decade club, where there were not many logging libraries, and we're just putting information somewhere so that we can review it to try to figure out what the heck this piece is doing. And now the landscape is so much more sophisticated. There's great tools out there. We have a new buzzword, APM, for application performance monitoring. And now we have open telemetry, which is a group that has gotten so many people to agree how to talk about the essential elements of understanding what the software is doing. And so I'm thinking, from myself as a young programmer, I was just trying to get stuff working. And then I celebrated when I got it working. It's like, hey, this library helped me get it working. But from an architecture perspective, the libraries continue to come out, but doesn't somebody have to recognize when a new library or framework does a pretty good job implementing a pattern that before maybe we had to do a lot of custom code to implement?
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the benefits that we have with this experience. And while we certainly are guilty in this space of reinventing the wheel and then calling it something new and then pretending we've never done anything like this ever before, except for all the times we've done something like this. But as we gain experience, as we gain this maturity, you're starting to see some of that stuff get baked in. And so what before, to your point, was something we'd have to hand roll and know that existed in order to hand roll it, you now just get the benefit of it because it's baked into your framework, and that's a huge lift for us. You go back far enough, and the first step in a project was, well, you and I'd have to write a compiler. Well, thank goodness we don't have to do that anymore. Yeah. And then we had text editors, and I've written code of the text editor.
That's the quadruple decade club.
It's possible. Yeah, but in college we didn't have a choice. Like that was the
assignment.
whatever it was. I can't even remember what the tool was, but I mean, we didn't have these tools that we have today. And these just continue to gain leverage. Now, that's a win for us because we're getting that advantage. We don't have to, we're able to be more productive. Unfortunately, our customers keep asking us to do harder and harder and harder things.
Yeah.
It seems like once we finally kind of get a feel like, yeah, hey, we're pretty good at this. Okay, now what we need you to do is, and you're like, whoa, really? And I mean, I feel like bridge builders must have felt at first, like the first bridge builder, like, cool, I knocked a tree over and across the river, and look, now it's easier to get over the river. And they're like, well, that's cool, but now we need to cross this even bigger river. And then you get to the point now where you look at some of these bridges and they're 35 miles long, and then they're just these amazing feats of engineering. And I mean, that's what they seem to do to us, except that it changes about every 6 weeks, where it's like, okay, well, yeah, cool, you launched the space shuttle. Good for you. Now what we need you to do is, and they just keep kind of cranking up that complexity as software eats more of the world. It puts more of that on us. So I feel like we're just kind of almost treading water with some of these things, where we invent these tools and are like, oh, okay, good. Finally, now we can catch our breath. And oh, nope, we're pushing you right back under because now we needed to do this and now we need to do that. And I don't know if that's going to end in our careers necessarily. Maybe AI replaces all that. I'm not expecting that to radically change our lives. I mean, it may be our kids, grandkids, great grandkids, but.
So you mentioned a architecture team, and certainly large companies, might have these architecture teams in multiple, development groups. Then on the way other end of the spectrum, there's a company that hires their first developer because they want some custom programs, and, in just the general language. In which case, that one person that kind of understands this whole software thing has to do kind of everything.
All of it. Yep.
Analyst, product management, architect, everything. Production help desk. Mm-hmm. So, what are the tranches along the way, just so the listeners can kind of put themselves in a box of the one man team, all the way to the uber big companies that just have scores and scores and scores of programming staff of all kinds? Can you give some categories of architects and where you think it changes in responsibility and scope?
Sure. Oh, that's a great question. To your point, there are still groups that have very small development teams. These very small companies where they may only have 2, 3, 4 people. Probably not going to have someone who's called architect. Mm-hmm. The role still exists, even if the title's not there. I've certainly run into organizations where I'll hear some variant of, well, we're agile, so we don't need architects. And it's like, okay, I understand. I mean, I know at least in the beginning, there were some collisions between how do we do architecture in an agile project and what's that mesh point look like. I'm very much of the opinion that those two go hand in hand just fine. But whether or not you have the title, you've got people making architectural decisions. And, my running joke, and I'm pretty sure I stole this from Neil, was, you'll know they're making good ones. I hope for your sake they're making good ones. You'll know in a year or two. And we've all run into that situation where, it may have been the right decision at the time, but then a year later, maybe a new requirement came along, something we hadn't anticipated, and blows that out of the water. Sometimes you just made a bad decision and you didn't have that experience in your back pocket to say, this is a likely sort of direction of change. This is something that's likely to be modified in the future. And so I need to set the application up to evolve in that direction. We can't predict the future. The best we can do is sort of study those trend lines and know kind of where things are going. We're going to put more stuff in the cloud. Feel pretty confident in that. I don't think I'd put my mortgage on, which cloud provider will be the one that rules them all. I don't actually think there will be one that wins, quote unquote. I don't even know what that looks like, frankly.
Yeah.
But as you get into bigger organizations, eventually you're going to find yourself in a situation where there's enough development going on that you need a person to sort of take that mantle of, all right, I'll be the one who goes and does that proof of concept to decide, do we use A or B? And I'm the one who's going to make some of these sort of governance-y like decisions around, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do this. Once you kind of get to that point where you've got multiple projects and you'd really like there to be some similarities across them, you've got to have somebody that can have that vision across the projects to say, no, don't do it 7 different ways. our approach to observability is going to be this. We're not going to let you use every single language under the sun. These are the 2 or 3 or 4 languages that we're going to focus on at this organization. And then it just kind of keeps seemingly multiplying from there. My last org, trying to think, I bet we had at least 2,000 developers, something like that. I mean, my line alone had more than 400 apps in it. I think we were the largest line. I might be wrong about that. My architecture team was a dozen or so. And that was replicated basically across every line of business. So it was a lot of us. And even then we were spread pretty thin. Even with, the 12, 15, whatever we had on our team, not all 400 projects were getting equal attention. You just can't. There's heat death of the universe will happen first. And, so you do the best you can to get to as many places as you can, and you focus your time on the teams that need it more than others.
So for pulling back to the teams that don't have someone designated with the title of architect, you said it still has to get done. How would you best verbalize what that it is?
I think there's a Ralph Johnson quote that says, architecture is the important stuff, whatever that is. And it's hard to define. I had a colleague once who dragged 20 engineers into a room and basically asked them to define architecture, and he got 20 different answers. And I was surprised he only got 20. But the way I look at it is it's those decisions that are hard for us to change later. Those decisions that we really hope we got right in the first place. Some of it is just understanding what matters for this application. And it isn't universal. It's not the same across every app. So I built this application for the use of my family, scratch and itch. And it was funny because as I was kind of working through it, I was working with my friend Deshaun, and I was kind of saying, okay, now I'm going to add like address. And so I'm going to need a state table, right? And he's like, no. I'm like, but Deshaun, I mean, in an app, you got to have a table that holds states, because then if you need it, and he's like, Nate, how many states do you actually need? I'm like, well, 3. He's like, okay, could it just be an enum? And I'm like, well, yeah, but what if I need to change something or add something? He's like, Nate, you're the developer.
Code can be changed.
Just deploy it.
Yeah.
And I mean, it took me a little bit of time to go, you're right. This would be so much more work for me to do it the enterprise way, and I get no benefit from it. And so it's the ability to look at that and say, it's okay for me to do it this way, even though that's arguably a shortcut or, not the right way to do it, because that's all this app needs. And so it's that ability to be able to look at that application and say, what's really important here? I worked on an app for a long time where my entire user population would have fit in a hotel ballroom. It was a couple hundred people max.
Yeah.
That thing did not need to scale to infinity.
Right.
I never needed to worry about 10,000 concurrent users or any of those kind of problems.
Right.
And so it's recognizing that this additional engineering that we might be tempted to do is wasteful here. We don't need it to do that.
Yeah.
So let's not focus our effort on that. We need to focus our effort over here. I mean, I know as an engineer, I was guilty of gold plating lots of stuff. You get down this path, and you're like, oh, well, but we might need this, so let's do all of these things. And only to realize later that, that was all wasted. We got to drag that along now for the next 10 years. And we didn't get any benefit from it.
Yeah.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
In software, it's not like designing a car. And of course, I want you to disagree with me if you think I'm wrong. I don't see it as designing a car where the person buying the car is going to drive the car and the two experiences are linked. I see it as buying a bus where a company is going to buy a bus, but then is going to have somebody operate it, and then they're going to use it to make money by moving other people around. And so,
Right.
and so, because of that, I'm sorry, a bus is just not going to have the same number of cup holders, right? Because you start with a business model and a budget, and then say, and really, I'm thinking, okay, what is the capital expenditure to move a person? Whereas if I'm buying a personal car, I'm thinking, oh, what can I afford? Level of comfort, gas mileage. I mean, it's totally different color thinking. And I think when businesses commission some software and we ask them, hey, what would you like it to do? And we start designing and whatnot, we're totally backwards as opposed to starting with the budget. It's like, hold on. Right. If it costs more than what dollar amount, would you say that you would not even want to build your own custom system? Let's really understand your budget, because it's a real constraint, isn't it, for most businesses?
Oh, of course. Well, I mean, I know in my history, I've been on at least a couple of applications where this really should have been purchased off the shelf. Building custom software here was not in the best interest of the budget. That said, the decision maker was powerful enough that they didn't care.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this was to feed an ego. I mean, sometimes these projects are vanity projects, and
so they had enough budget. It was just unnecessary.
Well, or they were able to convince somebody that this was really super important, and we absolutely have to do this custom.
Yeah.
Although I still think the worst of all worlds is when you try to customize off-the-shelf software. I think you do one or the other. If this is secret sauce and this moves the needle for you, this is generating revenue, by all means, custom software makes sense. If it's not that, if it's just ancillary background kind of things, then you should buy off the shelf. That's why it exists. I don't think anybody's writing their own HR software anymore, right? I mean, you're using one of the package vendors, I assume. But I'm hoping you're not spending 3 years customizing that. I mean, I've seen that happen where you bring in this, what is industry leading off the shelf software and is ostensibly the best of breed across hundreds of organizations, learnings across all sorts of companies doing this function. And we're selling you that. And then they take it and completely customize it. I'm like, why are you doing this? I mean, it's a wonderful thing for the vendor, because they're now going to have 20 to 100 people on staff essentially for the next N number of years. So I mean, it's good from their revenue standpoint, but from the using of the software, it's like it seems like a questionable call.
Well, that seems it's also an architectural decision, because executives want to know what the trade-offs are. In your book, Thinking Architecturally, you mentioned that. How did you phrase it about developers and architects and trade-offs versus possibilities?
So this is a Rich Hickey quote, and basically his point was that developers know the benefits of everything and the drawbacks of nothing, right? That we're always good at saying this is why we need to do this. We're never so good at, or not so good at, saying this is when you shouldn't do this. And by the way, that's one of those ways where I can tell how mature someone is with a technology, is essentially trying to figure out, do you know where the edge of the map is? Do you know where this is you should not use this?
Yeah.
And I have certainly been guilty of this. I've seen it a lot of my projects, but resume-driven design is a real part of this. New shiny technology comes out and we're all like, oh, thank goodness, I'm finally going to get this on my resume. And then we're like, we need to use this on this project. And I'll say, okay, cool. Why? And then the person repeats the name of the thing to me. And I'm like, great, but why? I mean, what does this do for us?
Yeah.
What is this particular type of data store? Is this really that much better than, the relational data store we've been using? And if we've got a specific requirement where, no, hey, a time series database would be the bomb here, great, then let's do it. But let's not bring it in just because somebody, saw it on social media and said, I want that on my resume. So you've got to understand the trade-offs. Now, I very much think that's part of my job as an architect, is to explain that to that stakeholder and help them understand, hey, listen, I know you want to do shiny new software here. And believe me, as an architect, I want to build it. But let me make you aware of the fact that there are commercial things out there. Now, at the end of the day, I'm generally not the decision maker. If the power that be says, no, I want this, okay, then we'll go do that. I'll shed light on the risk. It's someone typically on the business side who's going to say, I accept that risk, or no, let's mitigate it. And that's fine. And that's hard, because there's plenty of times where I'm like, you are making a bad choice.
Yeah.
But
one of the challenges too, I mean, the whole agile movement over the last 20 years hasn't really solved this, but it's a business executive that, waves a sufficiently large budget up in the air and says, surely we can create a significant software system for this amount. And they start creating this backlog, and we're looking at the backlog and saying, yeah, it's lots of stuff. And of course, developers are used to being able to figure out stuff. So a developer's going to look at, and I remember my young self looking at every item on the backlog. It didn't matter if I'd ever done it before. There was of course I can figure that out. I can figure that out. Yeah.
How hard could that possibly be?
Exactly. And it seems to me like there is this inflection point where some features are fully supported by the language framework, libraries. There's examples out there. There's plenty of developers out in the labor force that have done very similar things before. Yep. You can tap them, and it's just called like normal feature development. Oh yeah, I just have to assemble this code. And then you get to the point where, wait a minute, now we're inventing things. Mm-hmm. None of the developers on the team have ever done this before. There's not a framework out there from any of the vendors that does this. I don't know of any other company or team I can talk to at a user group or conference that's ever done this before, but it's on my backlog, and now I'm in inventing mode, and I start down that path, and then the business executive is like, when are you guys going to finish? How long is this going to take?
Right.
And they were not made aware at any point that an inflection point like that is even a thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it's because that's not what we experience in other spaces. In software, because we haven't been around that long, right? I mean, we're basically a human generation that we've been writing software, maybe. And really
1959.
Yeah. I mean, and if you look at how sort of this hockey stick that we've been on over the last 20, 30 years, I mean, I would say it's really only maybe in the last decade and a half, maybe 2 decades, where you really started to see this stuff just take off, and everything is becoming software in some way, shape, or form.
The internet age from the early 90s. The internet age is totally different software.
I remember saying that to my college advisor, that I felt like this was the next inflection point. And I said, I think this internet thing's going to be kind of a big deal. And, I was putting it kind of in the same sort of industrial revolution sort of thing. And he's like, no, it's not. And I keep thinking I need to go back to campus and be like, hey, Jim, do you still agree with that? Or how do you feel about it now? I mean, granted, we have perfect hindsight. It's very easy to say that. And I can see why he would have been skeptical back when I first made that comment. But so the moral of the story is we are inventing things on the fly. We're building, castles in the sky out of clouds with tools that we just created a couple of minutes ago. And then you've got customers over here going, how come you can't tell me when it's going to be done? Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, because I don't know how long it takes to invent this. We're in uncharted territory here. We, in some ways we're like Lewis and Clark, and are just, hey, we're going west. We have no idea what we're going to find, and we're going to map it as we go. I can't even imagine how you would do a project like that. How would you estimate a project like how long is it going to take for you to explore the western part of the United States? And yet, seemingly, that's what we do on a lot of projects.
Yeah. Well, I guess since 2006, I've been firmly in the consulting world. And so I've had to drudge through figuring out how to explain some concepts to a whole wide range of people who maybe just maybe commissioning their first big software buy. Like they've never, and one thing I figured out is most of those business executives or business owners have actually had interaction with a civil architect, whether it was just building out some office space, or maybe they've built a house, or even a barn, or they're somewhat familiar with that, and they can see blueprints. Right. And one of the things that I found successful is to be able to tell them, hey, just like when you're building a building, and we're asking you what you'd like to do, we are going to advise you if we ever get in a situation where we start talking about something that is not buildable by the available workforce and the available materials and the available tools. Because if we ever get in that aspect, then it's just like you building a house, but instead of sheetrock 2x4s and concrete, we're going to start by inventing new compounds to pour a different type of foundation. And then we're going to start growing our own custom grafted trees to harvest our own wood from. And that gets expensive. So there will be a time where we start to drift in that. I'm going to advise you on that because you do not want to spend money in that area. And with that, they tend to get that type of explanation. And then when we go and say, okay, the way we're talking about this, we're starting to go in invention, research, and development land. And then they get, oh, yeah, you told me about that. Okay, what is possible with existing materials, existing labor force, and existing techniques?
Mm-hmm. That's a great way to describe it, because we often use that as an analogy. This is like building a house. This is like building an apartment complex, whatever. And we're borrowing those concepts because, again, we're new. And so we don't have a lot of this. We don't have this big body of knowledge. We don't have a professional exam that you have to pass after college. There's that interesting line where if you're getting your engineering degree, and I saw this, someone made this comment. They said, today, if I make this recommendation to you, well, hey, I'm just a college student. What do I know? But after I pass this test tomorrow and I give you that advice, I'm legally liable for what I told you.
Yeah.
And if your house breaks because I told you to do this, that's on me. We don't have that. And I don't think that's going to happen soon. Certainly not during our careers. I mean, at some point in software, this will start to codify more than it already has. But you think about, the homes that you and I are in as we do this call. These concepts have been around for millennia.
Mm-hmm.
We've been living in homes for thousands of years, and
wood is a great building material for a long time,
and we've used it for a long time.
Yeah.
But what we have is building codes.
Yeah,
and those building codes evolve over time, and you run into these scenarios on a semi-regular basis where if you do a home renovation project of a certain size, oh well, now you've got to completely redo this and redo this and redo this. A friend of mine just put sort of an addition, so to speak, onto his house, and he wanted to run some electricity out there.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, of course, then became now you need to completely redo your circuit panel. And well, now we need to bring your house up to code. You need to have more fire alarms around your house. And it what should have been in the beginning a simple project has all these ripple out effects.
Mm-hmm.
So it isn't uncommon in the construction world. It's just that we have these bigger building blocks where we know what the characteristics are.
Mm-hmm.
We know that, if you tell me you want this to be a 25-story building and it's in a place that suffers from earthquakes, well, this is what we have to do for the foundation. And this is what we have to do to counter the fact that the earth is going to move and we don't want this building to topple over. Now, in fairness, some of those things we learned the hard way because buildings fell down and we're like, let's not do that again. But that's taken us hundreds, if not thousands of years for us to codify that. We don't have that in software yet. We're getting them, right? We already talked about that, how we're getting some of those building blocks and some of those things that when you and I first started doing it, where you got to do this by hand. Well, no, that's just part of your language. That's part of your framework. And you get the benefit of that for free. It's just there. And in many cases, you don't even realize that you're taking advantage of that thing. And that's really powerful. So it's going to take us some time. And I think a lot of folks that we work with, because we're the only ones that can see this, they don't fully appreciate how hard it is to modify it.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're building a new house and they've already poured the foundation and you come and you look at it and go, well, now that I see it, I'd really like it to be bigger.
Yeah. Can we enlarge the bathroom?
Right. It's doable, but it's going to change the budget.
Right.
And it's going to change the end date. You are never going to be in the middle of a construction project and say, well, listen, I don't want this to change scope or budget, but I would like this to actually be twice as big as it is. And that shouldn't be a big deal because, you're not that far along.
Yeah.
If you did that in the construction world, you'd be fired as a client immediately. And yet we get this all the time in our space. And I think some of it's because they just see us typing and they're like, well, how hard is it to type?
The materials are invisible.
I type all day. I type email and I can change email, no problem. Well, okay. Some things are admittedly fairly easy to change. And some of this is on us helping them understand why, if you just want to change the look and feel a little bit, that might not be as big a change. But what you're asking for, while in your mind is simple, you don't understand the ripple out effect that has on the rest of the code, where if you move this from, well, I thought this was a one-to-one relationship, and now it turns out you're telling me this is a many-to-many relationship. Okay, well, that's going to change some stuff. And that might be weeks, months of work to change that. And because we're the only ones that can see it, and because that is an abstract concept, it's hard to get a decision maker who's used to just saying, well, we're going to open up a new business in Canada, go. Okay, but there's a whole lot of things that are need to change in our software if all of a sudden now we're under Canadian law as well.
Can't you just add an item to the drop-down list?
Right? How hard could it be? Provinces. How hard could that be? Well, there's an awful lot that goes into something as simple as, and we're going to open a store in Canada.
You're right that you can see the materials in the construction world, but our materials are invisible until we do a demo. But to the extent we don't track how much time we actually spent putting option A in place, we could maybe demolition cost in software is near zero if we just built a feature, but we're not getting that time back.
Right.
And so it's like I found it helpful. And again, in the consulting world, it's a lot about training the customer if they've never done software before and what to expect. And early in the project, if the first time they change something, it's like, no big deal. Absolutely. No problem whatsoever. We can change it. Absolutely. I think we spent this number of man days on this feature. So let's add that to the end of the project schedule. We'll get this changed. And actually, we can have it demoed probably by next week. But guess what? The end date of the project just extended by the amount of unrecoverable time. It's not a bad thing. It's just like, that's just what it is.
Well, and sometimes the change is actually fairly trivial, and it does not have major ripple out effects. And sometimes we're pretty good at anticipating where those deltas might need to happen, and we do a pretty good job of building in some joints so that it can move and expand and contract. If lots of bridges are designed that way, where there's spots in that bridge for it to expand and contract as temperatures get hot and cold, et cetera. But you got to kind of anticipate that. I'm going to go on a limb and say they built a bunch of bridges without that, and then they started getting lots of cracks, and eventually some civil engineers said, new rule. We're going to build of a bridge over a certain height and a certain this and a certain that, and these temperatures must have.
Yeah.
So that's part of our challenge is this for us is all passed down kind of word of mouth. And it's me telling you a story about something I ran into and you telling me a story. And then that's how we're accumulating that knowledge. A lot of companies make it essentially impossible, or they highly discourage you from talking about things that didn't go perfectly, or even talking about things that went well. Oh, no, we can't talk about that. That's proprietary.
Company secret.
And so you have to rely on the fact that, you and I are friends and you and I are catching up at a conference and having coffee or whatever. And hey, I got a war story for you. But that's how we learn.
Yeah.
And that's how we get this stuff passed around that, hey, this is likely to change. This is one of those places you need to have some indirection layer. This other thing, believe me, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've never seen anybody change that. And so you start to get a little better at anticipating where some of those things are. But customers need what the customer needs. If the business needs this, if hey, business has changed, we've got some new driver, new demand, we better figure it out. I think about, the pandemic had some very interesting ramifications for all of us, obviously, some positive, some negative. But I think about the restaurants in my neighborhood. I think before the pandemic, there were maybe 2 restaurants that I could have ordered for delivery.
Right.
Now, basically all of them do it.
Yeah.
And that's one of those things where as a restaurant, if you're the business, they're like, well, I don't really want to do this. Well, now you kind of don't have a choice. Like it's this or you go out of business.
On top of that, if you wanted to start a restaurant, you don't even need a building or anything. You publish your menu, you put yourself online, you register with some delivery services, and you just start cooking in your house. And guess what? You're a delivery-only restaurant.
Yeah, ghost kitchens. I've run into that. There's actually a ghost kitchen in my neighborhood, and I actually had a delivery person once who contacts me. They're like, "Where is this place?" And I'm like, "It's right there." And like, "No, it's not called that. It's called this." I'm like, I know they run a ghost kitchen out of that restaurant called this. Just, trust me, go in, they'll have it. And, you could tell the delivery person had never run into that before. But that's another new thing. And so, disruption is affecting all of us in ways, shapes, and forms. And so that's part of where I do have some sympathy towards my business partners on this. They don't have a choice on some of these things, and it's like, I know this isn't convenient for us. We thought this only needed to be 2 stories. Now it needs to be 5. But hopefully they can at least understand that that's going to have ramifications. Like that change isn't free.
Yeah.
We cannot deliver it on that schedule, on that budget, with that level of change. To your point, while they were building my house, if they were still in the process of digging the foundation and I thought, oh, wait a minute. Okay, well, that's a point at which the change is possible. It would have been expensive, believe me, but it could have been changed. Now, to expand my house like a foot in one direction, not worth it. Way too expensive
just
to
not
do
worth
something
it.
like that. No.
Right.
So, and that's part of our challenge, right? Is being able to communicate that to folks who did not grow up playing with computers, who think in a different way, and that's fine because they do things I can't do, and that's great. But then the challenge for me is communicating that to them in a way that does resonate, and they can understand that I'm not just throwing jargon at them.
Yeah. Well, as we kind of close up here, we've been talking about thinking architecturally, and you've got an O'Reilly book that's been out for some time with that title. But as I understand it, you're working on a new book project. What can you tell us about that? What's public, and what would you have to kill us if you told us?
I don't have to kill you. There's no NDAs involved. It's fundamentals of software engineering. So it just went out on early release within the last couple of days. I'd have to go back and check my email to see exactly when it was originally pushed out. I think we're a little behind schedule. Jakob and I, maybe our eyes might have been a little too big as we jumped into this, although we have several chapters that are in the middle of review right now. So I think there's 2 chapters out right now, but more coming quickly. It's my effort to try to fill in those gaps, and the way that Jakob and I talk about it is this hopefully is that thing you would want someone to read in their first few weeks on the job, when they're like, I don't know what this is all about. I don't know where the gaps are. There's this whole universe of things you don't even know you don't know when you first get out of university or out of a boot camp. It's hopefully this will help fill those gaps in and then give you the directions to go. I mean, we obviously can't cover all of these topics in depth. We could write an entire book on usability. So I get a chapter to talk about that, right?
Yeah.
But I'm going to then throw you at, and then here's the other things you should read. But I also think this is a book that can help people as they progress in their career. And so sort of the tagline here is from coder to engineer. It's that distinction of, when you first start, we're just kind of banging on the keyboard. But if you want to get promoted, if you want to be a tech lead, these are the things you need to know. And you need to have that broader perspective of a software project. You need to understand some estimating. You need to understand what QA does and how we work with QA. What does it mean to put this into production? How do you write code that's meant to be read by human beings? And just, it's some of those subtler things. I'm going to talk about some soft skills in there too, because I think engineers love to ignore soft skills. And that's a huge part of what holds some of us back, is we don't realize that networking is not just for computers, that I actually do need to be at least a little involved in some of that. And, so that's, our goal anyways, hopefully to try to fill in some of those gaps, or at least expose people to where those gaps are, so that they can then explore more deeply into the areas as they need them, and as their passion dictates. But I have done it as a 3-week course on O'Reilly. That's kind of where this material has been workshopped, I guess, if you will. And then now we're going to put it in prose form as well. So early access is out there. We're definitely wanting feedback. So, if you're on the O'Reilly platform, you can go in there and give it a whack and let us know what you think. And then we'll keep iterating and improving it. And
we'll include a link to the early access in the show notes. I always take notice of books that come out and they're not about any particular technology. I mean, you have to talk about technology and programming languages just to talk about something, but they're not about how to use vendor's product A or B. I mean, there's tons of books on there, and you need those books. Right. But the most impactful books that I've read throughout my career were not about any one particular programming languages. It was about how to think about an aspect of software.
Yes. No, I mean, Pragmatic Programmer is one of the most influential books I've ever read in that space. How to Win Friends and Influence People is one I recommend constantly.
From Dale Carnegie.
I make my grad students read that. And it's one of those things where the older I get, the more interested I am in these longer living skills. Every skill has a lifespan to it. And some make fruit flies look like, a long living species. You look at a lot of the stuff we do with frameworks, or JavaScript in particular. A lot of JavaScript UI frameworks tend to be flavor of the day, and there's always another one, and they're changing very rapidly. And so you need to know that, like, you need to be able to get in there and build an application using pick your favorite one. But that's pretty transitory. I mean, I think of how many JavaScript frameworks I've used in my career.
Yeah.
And I haven't even done UI programming hardcore in more than 10 years. And so that knowledge has a lifespan.
Yeah.
Even languages, so if you're not coding day in, day out, the languages continue to evolve and they add features. And then you're like, oh, yeah, this is actually the right way to do this now. So I am more drawn towards those longer lasting skills, those things that are going to be valuable for you from day one of your career to, frankly, till you retire. And that's why I think the Dale Carnegie book is so powerful, because that's useful to you throughout your career. Even if you decide, I don't even want to look at software anymore, fantastic. Book's still good, still helpful, still going to improve your career. So that's one of those things that I really urge developers in particular to embrace, these longer lived skills. And I know a lot of times we look at those and go, oh, those are soft skills, and I'm an engineer and I need to focus on hard skills. Yeah, sure. But there's nothing wrong with the soft skill stuff. And by the way, it will last you a lot longer than framework of the day, JavaScript of the day kind of stuff.
Yes. And for those who are kind of watching the video version, the podcast, the book behind you, one of the books is Working Effectively with Legacy Code by Michael Feathers. I remember, was it 2004 or 5? I read that book. And the way I remember it is, it's interesting for refactoring and modernizing old code, but it changed the way I write new code.
Yes, absolutely. Because you start to appreciate, well, what will this look like in a year or 2 or 3? And I think we've all had that experience where we're staring at some code and we're thinking like, what idiot wrote this? And then it dawns on us that,
oh, wait, it was me.
It's me. I'm guilty. And so you start to appreciate that code, what we're really doing here is communicating with another developer. And that might be us. We might be communicating with future us. So we need to write code to be read by humans. The compiler is an ancillary consumer of code. And so that's the important part. And arguably that's what design is in our space, is writing the code so that another developer can come along and go, I see what you were doing here.
Yeah.
I would expect that I could show you my application that I wrote in Spring and Java. And while, certain bits of it, are going to look different than what it would be if you'd written that application in .NET, you'd understand the gist of it. And you'd understand what I did and why I did it. And hopefully I wrote the code clearly enough that you would even be able to say, okay, I don't understand this exact thing in Java, but I know what this method is doing.
Yeah.
So that to me is such an important part of this skill too, is realizing that we are doing this for the people that come after us.
Right.
And we need to appreciate that we will also come after someone else. So it's not pure altruism, although I would say the golden rule is a pretty important part of this equation. Do treat others the way you would want to be treated. So what do you want to see in the code base, and act accordingly.
Right. Exactly. Man, we could talk for hours on this topic. I have a whole bunch of other questions for you, but with the time, so we're going to wrap it up here. Man, Nate, I'm going to include the links that we mentioned in the show notes, both of the books, and how people can get to your website and your Twitter. So that they can contact you and whatnot. But man, thanks so much for coming on the Azure DevOps podcast and sharing with us about thinking architecturally.
Well, my pleasure, man. Thank you so much for having me. And, happy to continue this conversation at a future date. Hopefully our paths are going to cross again sometime before KCDC next year. And, right. We could catch up some more, because that was the thing I missed so much during the pandemic was having that face-to-face conversation. And that's the things, frankly, I love about doing something like this, is it at least gets us to able to do that in a virtual way. And while I'd rather be able to say, okay, then let's go get a beer.
Right.
I do appreciate that we had a chance to catch up. So thank you very much for hanging out with me. I appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure indeed. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.